Morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Welcome to Missing the Purple Pill. Our guest is Missing the Mark.
How are you doing, bro?
Hey, doing well, thanks. Doing well. Thanks for having me.
No
Well,
problem, bro.
tell the dear audience all about yourself and your life experience and what led you up to what you do now.
Oof, boy. Okay. How to do that and select for the stuff that will be interesting. Okay. So, in terms of sort of philosophically oriented, I'd actually been interested in philosophy very young, and like somewhere around the age of like 14, I was reading Plato's Republic, for example. I'd actually been into C.S. Lewis a bit before, and C.S. Lewis is a good introduction to like simple logical thinking. One of the things that Lewis does really well, he's a bit on the dry side, very intentionally, but one of the things he's really good at is just laying things out in very simple, direct, sort of logical ways, which is a really good introduction to just sort of how to look at things and think in sort of simple, direct ways. Somewhere around there, actually, I had gotten into Christian apologetics online. Now we're talking um, we're talking the days of like I was on AOL at this point. Um, this is before I had gotten internet, general internet access. Um, so I mean, we're talking the 1990s, and
Back when life
so
made sense.
I'm sorry.
Back when life made sense.
Eh, always has, always hasn't, depending on how you want to look at it. But
Oh.
um, the so I got into some curious arguments that I got into with some people, and there was a particular thing that influenced me there, which was coming across the what you might loosely call the hyper confident atheist, the person who they just make assertions, but they make them with phenomenal confidence. And when I was like 11 or 12, that really shook me quite a lot. Like and I would be talking with people who I probably quite a bit older than me. So part of that was just the age gap. I mean, no one is very confident at 11 or 12.
Yeah.
But part of it too is that like there are some, and I've recognized it again since I've sort of gotten back into that arena of the people who are just hyper confident in what they say. Um, and in sort of like a pushy sort of way. And so that's something I'll get back to later. Just want to mention, I encountered that. And then I sort of decided that at that point I needed to spend time away from apologetics and just do a lot of learning. Um, that I'd benefit from like a lot greater breadth of knowledge, background knowledge, and so on. So I did. I kind of stepped away from like the online apologetics then. And then, especially when I went to high school, I actually met I had two teachers in particular who really introduced me to philosophy, and introduced me to a lot of interesting books, and so did a ton of reading. I also got introduced to G.K. Chesterton, who's my favorite author. Although the funny thing is, I completely misunderstood his masterpiece is a book called Orthodoxy, which is a really good book. But I completely misunderstood it the first time and didn't like it at all because I was trying to read him as if he was C.S. Lewis. And G.K. Chesterton, I don't know if you've met him, encountered his writing, but
Yeah, we've heard of him.
yeah, he thrives on. He's very poetic in his writing. He thrives on metaphor and analogy. I mean, he's also a really good poet. Um, and he does a lot of paradox. He uses a lot of paradoxes and so on. If you try to read him as if he's C.S. Lewis, it makes no sense at all. And then somewhere around the last chapter, I suddenly got his style. And then I really did not like the book, but I was working through it. Then I got his style and went back and reread it and became my favorite book. I've since reread it about 20 times. Um, so then various other reading that I was doing in college. Okay. Oh, I should mention, since it's pertinent, somewhere in high school, around the age of 15, 16, somewhere in that range, I did become an atheist for about 3 days.
Only
Yeah, well, I worked through it a little faster than most because the thing is the I mean, the only kind of atheist I could possibly be is the nihilistic kind.
right.
It's either Nietzsche or nothing. And the thing is that kind of
The Nietzschean
sharpens your
Sartre
attention.
type of atheist.
I'm sorry, I apologize.
The Nietzschean Sartre type of atheist.
Yeah.
Well, Nietzsche's pretty distinct from Sartre. I mean, I can see why you're grouping them together, but especially the you know what? Actually, I withdraw that. Just yeah, and the thing about really taking nihilism very seriously is it focuses your attention. Um, and so I did a lot during those roughly 3. It might have been 4. I mean, my memory's a little off. It's more than 20 years ago now. Um, but somewhere in that range, you know. The it really focused my attention quite a lot on the problem. There was very little else that I was thinking of, and it was at one point, it's funny how things kind of stick with you. I remember I was looking at a box of tissues at the time, and it occurred to me at the time. It had nothing to do with my thoughts. Just it's one of those things that oddly important moments. Sometimes random details that don't matter stick with you. When I realized that the thing about atheism was that it makes sense and is coherent, but it is simply an alternative. That there are essentially 2 fundamental alternative worldviews. One of them being that the world is sort of an irrational accident that no one made, a joke that no one told, a joke with no punchline that no one told, as it goes. And that's consistent. It's a consistent worldview in which reason doesn't make any sense and nothing is rationally intelligible and so on. And and everything can sort of be explained within that in a consistent manner. Or alternatively, the world was created by God in a rationally intelligible manner, and we have rational souls capable of actually truly grasping truth and so on. And everything is also explicable under that set of hypotheses. And so, in that moment, what I realized is these are simply 2 alternatives. The fact that the atheistic one was consistent doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's possible. At which point the question becomes, well, of these 2 alternative hypotheses, alternative worldviews, which one actually matches what I see in the world? Which one seems to actually match reality as I find it? And as soon as I was able to get free of, oh, well, this one makes a lot of sense, so it must be true, to these both make a lot of sense, so which one of these is true? Asking the question in that way, the answer was clear that the world actually does, reason does actually grasp truth. The world is rationally intelligible, and this does seem to more accurately describe the world as I find it. And so that sort of, as I said, it sharpened my attention quite a lot. So I did a lot of hard thinking in a relatively short time because I was doing not very much of anything else and paying attention to nothing else. And so once I realized that, that's when I escaped from it, essentially. And so for me, it seems like that a lot, that atheism is essentially a mental prison. And it makes sense while you're in it, but it's easy to mistake that for it being true. The mere fact that something makes sense or is at least internally consistent is not the same thing as being true. And so so that was my experience of it. So then I proceeded on a lot more reading. I read a lot and a lot of things. Also did a bunch of reading. So I mean I was Christian at the time, but before and after that. But did a lot of reading on other religions because I find them interesting. I like to learn about them, especially in college. Learned a bunch of stuff. Took a very interesting course on the history of Chinese philosophy, going through various things that also touched on, since Buddhism is important, touched on the history of Buddhism, which is kind of fascinating. Also, I like to, when I find people who know things, I love to pump them for information.
So you can say the power of Christ compels you.
Yes.
I would hear that in movies a lot.
It's not a phrasing that I would normally use, but yes, I would say yes to that. It's not really a phrasing I've heard before in that sort of way.
Well, usually in movies, it's with a demon that's in the bed. You have a priest that says, The power of Christ compels you. The power of Christ compels you.
Yeah.
Ah, gotcha. Yeah, yeah. There's it is. I mean, I will admit one of the things about Christianity, and there are many, that all work together that make me believe it's true. But one of the things is just um, the nature of how Christ spoke. The philosophical insights he had that are essentially unparalleled in the way he has them. Um,
Oh, but
the
haven't you
various things,
heard?
but so
Yeah, but haven't you heard? He's not the first one to say to love your neighbor and your enemy. That was Buddha and Confucius in them.
yeah. Well, I mean, the Buddhist conception of compassion is kind of interesting, and no, I mean loving other people is not original to Christianity. I mean, I mean, if nothing else, you find it in Judaism.
Yeah. Love,
Earlier. I
love
mean,
your
point of
enemy.
fact, what are the two greatest commandments? Literally, are references to what you find earlier. Um, so they're literally references to things earlier on when he was, when Christ identified the two greatest commandments. I mean, heck, in one version, he specifically is asking one of the lawyers what he finds,
Yeah.
and tells him, "Yes, yes, you have actually correctly identified this." So, yeah, it's not that part. That's the original part.
That's usually what you get when you say that his teachings were the way he spoke was unparalleled.
Yeah.
You
Uh,
know, what I say with Jesus is that, some Christians, they have this allergic reaction to the Old Testament where they say, look, we're just going to chuck the Old Testament into the trash can and we're just going to focus on the Gospels. And I'm like, if you do that, Jesus becomes incoherent.
this is very true.
Mhm.
And the main
Very
reason
true.
why the Old Testament was included is because it provides the cultural background of the Savior of mankind.
Yes. I mean, also, it's just phenomenally important. I mean, you can't within um, within a Christian framework wherein Christ is the fulfillment of all of the promises of the prophets. It
Yeah.
makes zero sense to not include the script. I mean, the divinely inspired scripture of the Pentateuch and the
Right.
prophets and so on. To not include them would be just incoherent, given that these are all specifically inspired by God. So yeah, I mean, there's no intelligible way to do that, and um, it's
It borders on Marconianism.
oh God, my memory for heresies is a sieve.
It's basically the idea that the God of the Old Testament and the
Yeah.
God of the New Testament are distinguished.
And it
They're
usually
Okay.
and,
Was he one of the
and
Gnostics?
usually popped up from time to time throughout the ages with the Gnostics and then the Cathars during the Middle Ages and then on and on.
Gotcha. Yeah, yeah. I'm familiar with that in the Gnostic thing. Marconius. Yeah. I
Mar-
forget him.
Marcion, Marcionian, Marcion.
yeah,
Marcion. Yes, thank you. Was he actually one of the Gnostics, or is he separate from the Gnostics?
He's one of the Gnostics. The Church Fathers hated him.
Right. Okay. Yes. Thank you.
which,
That
funny enough, Hitler,
He
funny enough,
was-
like the Nazis chose to go to the one theologian in Germany that just so happened to believe in Marconianism in order to support their beliefs.
uh yeah, it's interesting. You various things can find support in curious quarters. Um, Thank you for refreshing my memory on Marcionism too. I don't know why. For some reason, I've read up on a great many of the heresies, and there are only a few of them that I can ever remember by name. I don't know why my memory fails me so reliably on those. Um, but yeah, so just to wrap up, so I spent a long time doing a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, and then sort of at some point figured that I essentially became satisfied with my preparation, and then started getting back into things. Um, that is still at the same time, and like what my channel is about is it's not apologetical really. Um, I mean, I talk about Christianity some because I how how can you talk about philosophy and avoid the most important things there are in life? So, it's not that I try to avoid Christianity, but that a lot of what I'm trying to do and a lot of what I've observed in the modern context is that so many people have such a cramped understanding of the world, such a cramped and narrow view, not just of the faith, but of natural things, of culture, of history, of just about anything, frankly. Um, I have a lot of sympathy with. I don't know if you ever saw the TV show Futurama. Um,
Yes.
Love Futurama. I
I
would
love
take that over to Simpsons, Family Guy any day.
yeah, Futurama. I really loved it, and I have a great deal of sympathy with when they called this the stupid ages. Um, because they would refer to this time period that we're living through as the stupid ages. Um,
Yeah,
and sort of
it would be kind of accurate because they're in the dystopia around us.
yeah. Well, that's the thing, and I don't mean this like in a critical sort of sense so much as people are largely the victims of modern philosophy, modern with the capital M, the one that started with Descartes and died with Kant and has been wandering the halls of academia ever since, like a zombie, eating brains, never getting any smarter for it. Um, the, uh, the modern philosophy, so that's the one that started with Descartes asking, is it possible to actually know anything? And, Descartes answered yes. I'm assuming this is just for the sake of people viewing. But Descartes answered yes, but no one believed him, and then it just sort of all went downhill from there. And so, in a very modern context, where where people generally have some, well, actually, as G.K. Chesterton said, if a man won't think for himself, he won't have no philosophy. He'll have the used up dregs of someone else's philosophy. And that's largely what when you talk to just sort of ordinary people, it's kind of what you see. They never really learned any coherent philosophy of life, and what they have are like a few bits of postmodernism, a few bits of modernism, a little bit of Enlightenment propaganda, and that's kind of it. And it's this little sort of patchwork of things that don't fit together. And so, a lot of what my channel is about, and why I started it, and why I look just all over, at different things. Like I mean, I haven't done song reviews in a while, but like it's something I do mean to get back to, including movie reviews, talking about
Yeah,
art and stuff.
definitely movie reviews in response to Village Atheists and with your deadpan humor.
Yeah, the anyway, so why I like looking at this stuff is because to some degree I try to think that like if you can help somebody learn to think about anything, it's a great start. If you can help somebody to see that truth is a thing, that rationality actually works, even if it's just about a song, even if it's just about art. Like what is art? You know, something like how can you have different artistic interpretations, but at the same time, that are legitimate, but not just say like, well, anything goes. Let's all stop thinking right now because anything you say is just automatically correct because it's about art. And how do you do the one but not the other? How do you approach things with some intelligence? What's the distinction to be made? Like anything, if you can get somebody to start thinking that to sort of give them some framework to have coherent thoughts on any subject, that this is a great start to eventually thinking about the most important things. So that's a lot of what my channel is about, trying to be of service in thinking about things. And it's not there's an overarching purpose, but that's not to say that when I look at some video I've got like hidden or coded messages in it. In a particular video about a particular subject, it's not about like sneaking ideas past. It's just about looking at something and then trying to like actually have essentially it's a little difficult to say to have a conversation about it because it's a recorded video. It's intrinsically one-sided, but at the same time to sort of work through what a real conversation about the subject would be like, to both to if there's any insight into the particular subject I can give, and more generally just to help with thinking about things. And also, there's a little bit of being one more place in the world you can come just to have, think about something interesting, because you can't always do that. And that's what we do with we always do with books. When you read a book about something, you're not literally having a conversation with the author, but you're doing something like that where you're there's a meeting of the minds, and you're able to look at something with somebody else. That classic description, that lovers stand face to face, in the sense of like the Greek word eros, but friends stand shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the world together. So there's also that, because there's so little thinking that goes on in this world on offer. So offering some of that as well. So that's a very long-winded answer, but I hope it answers the question.
But Chris, don't you know that art is just a bunch of ink splotches on a white canvas?
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously, there's no way to know the thing was done on purpose or that there was an artist who made it. It's all just a complete accident and emergent property. Obviously, that is definitely the case.
Do you think anybody today? Do you think anybody today could replicate the art that we see during the Renaissance?
I mean, it's tempting, of course, to say no, but that's said, I pull back a little bit, because there are some people who truly do just study the great masters, and we mostly don't hear about them. But who do study the great masters and who say, I don't care what people like nowadays. I love this. I'm just going to dedicate my life to trying to be able to do it. And some of them, at least, I mean, the greatest masters are just, sort of, once in a lifetime type of people. So, how much does lightning strike again? But there are some people who are doing art that is at least, if they're not Michelangelo, they're at least,
Oh yeah.
not embarrassing to stick in the same room as Michelangelo. Even if you might put them, in a smaller and off in the corner. If Michelangelo's work is in the same room, like, at least you might put them in the same building without shame.
Yeah. One of his as much of an impact he's made on the world of art, like one of the biggest mistakes he made was portraying God as an old man in the sky. That's where the caricature come from, and they just that you get the fundamentalists and fundy atheists just have that image in mind when they attack religion.
That is, yeah. I mean, well, there's a whole host of it. Angels having wings,
Yeah.
devils having, horns and pitchforks.
That was an older image based on the Greek god Pan.
Yeah, I mean, it was carried through, because when you're representing non-corporeal beings, you have to draw them somehow. When you're representing, like the idea of purgatory in art, like, well, how do you, since the concept of purgatory, is just from the Latin word purgation, meaning cleaning. Or, well, purgation is an English word, but the root of purgation, or purge, to clean. That the whole doctrine of purgatory is simply that after people die, if they're not perfect, they don't go to hell. They don't necessarily go to hell, but they may be able to be fixed such that they can be in heaven. So often a misunderstood doctrine. It's like, if you take the Venn diagrams of heaven and hell, people tend to think of it like it's this like big carve out of heaven, and then these people get punished. But actually, it's a large carve out of hell, and these people get to go to heaven. That's what the doctrine is. But in any event, the point being, art depicting purgatory. Well, how do you show people being fixed of their sins visually? Especially in a static painting, how do you show this? And so,
An Alcoholics Anonymous meeting.
Yeah, just a bunch of centuries before an AA meeting. And so, I mean, the idea of justice is balance, of fixing somebody, that if you're too attached to something, then being wrenched away from it is what will fix you from being too attached to it. And so, that generally you had, in that art, the people would be, tortured in ways that were directly the opposite of their sins. And so there was at least that idea that, like, to be fixed of something, you had to be pulled away from the thing you're overly attached to. So there was that, but it has, again, some very unfortunate consequences in the modern time, where people confuse art with literal theology. And, and so they think of purgatory as like a place where people with red skin and horns will actually, like, literally poke you over and over again.
To say nothing,
and hell is just where, like, they never stop poking you.
to say nothing of Dante's Inferno.
Yeah, Which again, no, I have to preface I haven't read yet. Someday, but yeah, no, I mean again, a very good example of where it's symbolic. But the problem with symbolism is some people think that symbolism is like a manual, like an IKEA instruction book. Um,
They have autism.
I'm sorry, they have what?
Autism.
Oh, well, in some cases they just never learned. I mean, there are a lot of people who don't seem to have ever learned how you go about understanding symbolism.
Or they're just Drax.
There's that. I mean, but don't forget the modern context.
Mhm.
So we have, how many, newspapers and TV shows and so on, where what is their ostensible focus? Ostensibly, and let's pretend for a moment that the newspapers and so on, that everything they do is actually like living up to the highest standards of what it in theory is. Um, Requires a lot of imagination, but bear with me for a second. Supposing it was this, what are they doing? They are trying to give exact descriptions of events to give you essentially the time and space transported experience of having actually been there. They are not within a newspaper or television news, etc. And again, I'm talking about in theory, not what a lot of the practice is. But in theory, they're not trying to tell you what was important. They're not trying to help you understand what actually matters here. In theory, what they're trying to do is simply give you essentially like a transcription of what happened so that it would be like you were there yourself, except without the inconvenience of having been there. And since this is a large fraction of what people are exposed to as the theory of what like communication about events primarily is, it's explicitly supposed to, in theory, not be symbolic. It's supposed to be not just a literal description, but a literal description in the sense of like just transporting time and space, the experience of having been there. And so, with being soaked in that as at least the theory, and then often you'll find that it doesn't live up to the theory, and that it's their agendas, their things that are false, etc., etc. But that said, the theory of it, at least, how it presents itself, is like that.
Yeah.
Um, and so, since it presents itself like that, a lot of people aren't familiar with somebody who is telling you not trying to transport the experience of having been there in the manner that a modern reporter in theory is, but rather who's trying to tell you the important stuff about what happened, who's trying to make intelligible to you what really matters about having been there. That is to say, who's engaging in things like symbolism, who's trying to convey not surface level perceptions, but deep truths. And they largely don't experience this. I mean, if you think even like, I was having a conversation with an intelligent friend of mine not that long ago, where he was talking about what symbolism is, and the way symbolism is often taught in literature in high schools, in America at least, um, is as if like it's like symbolism is like a code book, right? Like it's the standard like high school English, literature
Mm.
class is like, you've got your code book, and like this thing happening translates to, you know, he is in favor of labor unions. And like, it's like your symbolism, the way it's often taught in school is if you're trying to like, there's like a hidden symbol message that's like, a dozen words long or so, and you're just trying to decode the thing. And for some reason, the person encoded this like 10-word message into an entire play. And so it's a very, very, the way they encrypted this thing into the play is like a very uh, inefficient use of space and time. Um, and so, like, that's the sort of thing that people are exposed to. They're taught is how you interpret symbolism of what symbolism is. So, like the idea that symbolism is that this thing has the same structure as reality, but it's, simpler so you can see the structure more clearly. It's not, I've got like a 10-word coded message that I'm just encoding badly, but rather, like I'm presenting the same structure as reality. is something they're just not taught. They're taught basically the opposite, and most of what they experience as people relating events claims to be something else again entirely as well. So to some degree, where would people in a modern context ever meet, genuine instruction and real symbolism in this world?
Makes sense. I did love some of your takes on your channel about Matt Dillahunty and the problem of gumballs.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh yeah, he responded to you on that one. Commented on your channel.
Oh, that.
He commented on a video of mine debunking him a while back, and he got into a back and forth with some other guy who was fighting with him, and then he just deleted all his comments and ran away. Does that sort of thing when he's back into a corner. Like, he blocked me on Twitter because I corrected him about the Christians burned down the Library of Alexandria, which is a concocted fairy tale.
Oh yeah, I'm not surprised. He never impressed me in my few interactions with him.
Yeah, but he just has this cult following. It's just absolutely bizarre.
Yeah, well, do you remember when I mentioned that interesting the hyper confident atheist that I encountered?
Yeah,
he strikes me as one of them. That he, I think part of why he has a cult following. Okay, well, I mean, one reason I think is that there's probably some element of luck,
and because he's basically the platform for where junior grade village atheists go to. Recovering fundagelicals go to, and they see him as a father figure, like
yes.
him and Aaron Rod Nelson and Seth Andrews and all those other fundamentalists.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's very right, and especially, for anybody, especially like teenage atheists, atheists in their early 20s, anybody, especially who, for whatever reason, is looking for like a father figure in their life, somebody like that, where he has that sort of confidence. He's got that, look, this is really simple. I'm just going to lay it out. It's like you had the gumball.
The rhetoric. Without the rhetoric, he's nothing.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a fairly literal sense, like I don't think he does. I mean, okay, let me clarify what I'm saying. To my exposure to him is almost entirely the gumball thing. When I got asked the question, I answered the first video that I did. I answered about the thing that a commenter had asked me a question where he summarized the gumball argument, and I did a video where I was explicitly saying, like, I'm answering this question. I read the question out and answered that particular question about the gumball, and he showed up and saying that, like, this was not a good representation of the gumball. So I went and actually looked up his original gumball analogy, and yeah, so what you said about he's nothing without the rhetoric is, I think, a fairly literal description, in that it's not like there is logic or thought or anything else that you could separate from the rhetoric. All he does is rhetoric. There isn't. It's not like there's a rhetorical layer and a logical layer. There just isn't. There's only the rhetorical layer. So it's not just that he wouldn't be popular. I'm not sure exactly the sense you meant, but if what you meant was he wouldn't be popular without the rhetoric, right. I think he simply would be silent without the rhetoric.
Like he wouldn't be effective without it. Like, he's trying to hang on to what little relevance he has left, because new atheism is waning as of late, because it's been attached to social justice and woke cultism and stuff like that. So,
well, I do think there's another thing too. I'm sorry. I just want to say I'll add this when you're done speaking.
Yeah. All right. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
I mean, because his followers are so feral and rabid howler monkeys, they can't stand the idea of him losing a debate. Like, every debate he's in, he's good at smacking down low-hanging evangelical fruit. I mean, who isn't? It doesn't really take much effort. Like, when he's up against the high intellectuals like Inspiring Philosophy, Jordan Peterson, David Wood, he just gets absolutely demolished. but they have to cover his ass because he looks bad without it. Like saying, "Oh yeah, he got destroyed and this and that."
Well, there's another thing that goes on there. I mean, I believe you're right, but there's another layer as well, which is the problem with any sort of the problem of explaining things at a higher level to people of lower capacity. And a lot of his followers seem to be people of, you know, who are not especially gifted, highly gifted in the natural virtue of the intellect, which is not a moral thing. It's just, it's like being tall or short, or to be short is simply to not be tall. It's not a moral quality. There are great saints who are short, and the great sinners who are tall. It's a natural virtue. But if they don't understand the more intelligent person, in this, like if Dillahunty was talking with Jordan Peterson, if they don't understand what Peterson is saying, and the fact that they like Dillahunty suggests they probably don't have the capacity to really understand Peterson very well, it's going to be at a fairly fundamental level. Like, it's probably going to be to them a bit like Peterson was just speaking in French and they don't speak French. They'll catch the occasional word that's like a homophone to English.
Right, selective hearing based on tribalism.
Well, it's not just that. Like, if they're not very bright, to put it very bluntly, like if we're talking about people who, metaphorically speaking, I mean, IQ is basically only really primarily useful for predicting how a person will do on an IQ test, but it makes a great metaphor because the standard deviations of it. So if you're talking about, metaphorically speaking, somebody with like an IQ of 90 and below, Jordan Peterson will probably sound to them primarily like he's speaking French. Like, they just don't know what the words he's saying in that order actually refer to in the world. Like, what do these things mean? And the thing is, when a person doesn't understand somebody else, they'll have one of two reactions on the basis primarily of that person's reputation within their community. If they think of them as somebody who is, respectable and smart, their basic reaction will be like, "Wow, that sounds really smart. I have no idea what it means, but I assume it's really smart." If they don't have, and I've encountered that. Like, I've had people where I tried to explain something to them, and their reaction is like, "I have no idea what you're saying, but it sounds really smart." Well, okay, I mean, I guess it's a nice way to have failed to explain it to you, I guess. But the other reaction people will have, if they don't have that inbuilt cultural thing of like, this is a person you're supposed to trust who knows a lot more than you do, is, this is nonsense, that's a complete idiot. And so the problem is they're not really in a position to evaluate on their own which of these two things it is. So they have to rely on things like, cultural stuff. So it's not pure tribalism. They have to rely on the tribe as well, because they don't have the capacity to make that independent judgment. So I'm talking about, that subset of people, like, they metaphorically, like IQ, 80 to 90 type person, that they won't be able to evaluate what Jordan Peterson is saying for themselves, and so they'll have to rely on it.
They like to prop themselves up as having IQ of 150, stuff like that.
Well, yeah, that is kind of amusing when you see that. I mean, it's a funny thing I've done. I've with a number of people, of the sort of, as you call them, village atheists that I've encountered. I've asked them like a simple thing, like, okay, so you want me to prove something to you? Well, I don't want to waste my time, obviously, and hopefully you wouldn't want me to waste my time either. So can you give me a proof that you're capable of understanding proofs?
Or that you're capable of rational thought.
Yeah, any of those. I've used various ones of them. But I tend to go with the one that you're capable of understanding proofs, because it doesn't sound as much like an insult, and I'm not trying to be insulting. What I'm really trying to do is test them for consistency. But it's never a good sign when their answer is, well, how would I go about doing that? That's not a good sign. If you can't even conceive of how you could prove to somebody that you can understand proofs, it's not a good sign that you can. But, okay, fine. And I'll say, okay, pick something, not completely trivial, and prove it. Anything. Whatever you want, in history, in science, anything. Just, like, pick something and, like, give me a proof of it so that I can see that you can understand how a proof works. And that's a good indication you would be able to understand a proof presented to you. And Yeah, oh man, some of the proofs that I've got, and most of the time they won't, first off. The few times I have, like, the proofs I've gotten have been so bad. So bad. Um,
Such as.
oh, there's one. There's one where a guy was proving that Julius Caesar really existed, and like, it was like several disconnected
Oh, was
points.
the Christ myth there by any chance?
I don't know. I think this was in the context of just pick something and prove it. So he started proving that Julius Caesar existed, or I may have even suggested that. I forget. Um, so I don't know enough about him in the context because he actually took me up on this, which puts him ahead of a lot of his peers. Um, and but yeah, it was like a few disconnected facts. Like there's this like it was like one of them was like this thing mentions him. It was like some particular writer mentions him, but like not with anything about like why who the writer was, how we know that this writer was in any way contemporary, etc. Another one was that like a statue of Julius Caesar showed that he was bald.
Well, he was balding during his last years.
Right, but the proof that Julius Caesar actually existed was there's a statue of him that depicts him as bald. As like the entirety of this portion of the argument.
There's also statues of him that have a full head of hair. Like that's what Caesar means, a fine head of hair.
Well, but I mean, more to the point, like, is without any sort of additional connection, if you're not trying to fill in the argument for the guy, the argument, like, because it was like basically five disconnected premises. Conclusion, Julius Caesar, like at no point did any of these premises connect to each other. There wasn't like step two, 2 and 4 imply. There's nothing like that went on. It was just like four unconnected premises, and one of them was there's a statue of him that was bald. Like, well, will you accept a statue of somebody drawn as bald as proof that they exist in general? Like, if you see a statue of somebody that's bald, like does that mean that they did exist?
I'll see.
Or is there some more to your argument here?
Non sequitur.
Yeah, well, I mean, he was trying to go for something like the argument from embarrassment. I think. I'm guessing because he didn't actually say any of it, and when the explicit purpose of this is show that you can understand how argumentation works, disconnected premises with no connection, where you don't draw any like interrelated conclusions that work up to a final conclusion is not a good showing. Anyway, so just on the, like, yeah, they tend to think of themselves as smart. I actually had a video about that, by the way, because the other problem they run into is that, like, if you don't understand what the other guy is saying, one of the two of you is the idiot. I mean, there's some other possibilities, but it's a simple practical thing. Like, if you're saying words and I don't know what they mean, either you're the idiot or I am. And for a lot of people, that second possibility is a hard one to contemplate for various reasons. And so,
both could be true.
Well, right, yes, that's why I said there are technically other options, but if we keep it a little simple and a little practical,
like when you say the Bible is inspired by God, they'll tend to have this X-Files view of divine inspiration, like God planted this what to write in the Bible in the author's head, and then he was possessed, and then he wrote all this stuff, and then spirit left his body.
At the time.
Yeah, the spirit left his body after he got done writing, and like no, that's not what you mean at all.
Yeah, and yeah, no, that is very true. But just finishing off the previous thought, like, I mean, it is true that both of you could be idiots, but that leaves you in a pretty bad situation. So, and since you clearly understand what some people say, like you understand what Matt Dillahunty says, right? So clearly you can understand what somebody says, so that proves you're not a complete idiot. Because a complete idiot wouldn't be able to understand anyone. So clearly you're not a complete idiot. And then there are all these other people where you don't understand what they're saying. So either you're the idiot or they are. You're at least a partial idiot, or they're complete idiots.
Hitchens kind of did this a lot when he debated these top Christian apologists. They would get some of them would give the best arguments, and then he would just be like, "Oh no, your Lord and Savior is a terrible person. What a ghastly figure!" And then he would just go on this huge rants about the Old Testament stuff and how religion's being used throughout history, and just completely miss the point.
Yes, it really helped that he was drunk in 100% of his debates.
Yeah.
I mean, I actually mentioned that. I don't know if you know. I have a video. It's called Christopher Hitchens. Something like, no, Christopher Hitchens isn't serious.
Right, when he tried to compare it to Korea, the
Right.
dictatorship.
Yes. Exactly.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
all these atheist communist dictators felt no responsibility to God at all, even though he hates religion so bad that he'll try to project that onto them, even though they were explicitly anti-religion of all kinds.
Oh yes. Yeah. No, he does. The other thing is,
But don't you know that Christopher Hitchens, it was the modern Diogenes?
Even, but yeah, that's something else. With he also had, especially him, he and Dawkins have cult followings, and it's just they're so against religion, but they have religious tendencies, like in their religious fervor and how
well,
people
especially Hitchens.
follow them. Yeah, especially him.
Yeah.
Like many new atheists today are leftists, so if he were alive today, he would be sticking it to them instead. But they don't like to have that in mind.
Nah. Well, I mean, consistency across time is not a leftist virtue anyway. So, that actually reminds me of the thing I want to mention about the like Dillahunty and like back when he was relevant, now clinging to fading relevance. I think one major factor in the relevance of new atheism, that because if you look at when it came out right in the aftermath of September 11th, when Islamic terrorism was a major concern throughout much of the Western world.
Then they just start
And
attacking Christianity while looking at through the lens of fundamentalism in the South, and that madness started from there.
well, it's not just that, because there was a major problem people had in that since Islam tends to, especially in the oversimplified demographics a lot of Americans and Europeans have of who is Muslim, they tend to think of it as like they tend to confuse Islam with a race as well,
Yeah.
and so they could not, for various reasons, a lot of people could not be simply anti-Islamic. Like they could not be simply against Islam. They couldn't say like, well, obviously this religion is false. They couldn't say like, there's this aspect of the religion, um, of like, it was started by a warlord and
Yeah, David Wood goes into that. Like that's all. That's his entire shtick. He does not give a fuck.
no, he definitely does not. And and it's something that's important to mention when talking about Muslims, that obviously most the vast overwhelming majority of Muslims are not terrorists, and and there are some fairly peaceful strains of Islam, Sufi Islam, Sufi, yeah, like the Sufis, for example, come to mind as actually being a very peaceful strain of Islam. They tend to have a very mystical tradition. Um, but that said, the people, the Muslims who like Osama bin Laden, who look to the founder of their religion and see that he was a warlord who conquered a heck of a lot of people by the sword, and that decide they should be like him. That the time period, especially, it would be very hard to simply say like, yeah, they're doing this for their religion, and they're bad in doing this for their religion. And so people had to, couldn't for various reasons bring themselves to say that sort of thing. And so I think a lot of the impetus for new atheism was largely to be able to be critical of Islam. Basically, what worked really well in that particular context was to simply be critical of all religion. That it's acceptable, culturally acceptable for many of the people who sort of entered into this to simply be critical of all religion, in which case, well, I mean, everyone has to admit that Islam is a religion. And so, it would sort of fall under that general condemnation of religion. And so people who were in any event against all religion suddenly were useful in that time period. They were, suddenly, people who were already, because Dawkins had already been against religion, um, had pretty much his whole life,
Yeah, but
but
by that
suddenly
he
he
was
was useful to the moment.
just celebrity scientist in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but then he lost relevance around that time, and then he gained it back again by being a propagandist, basically. And now he's under fire from the woke mob. Like that's something else. Like the woke
Yeah,
religion we see now is probably is a product of the new atheists and their movement from 15 years
Well,
ever since then.
I
Because
mean,
when you try to get rid of religion, it'll manifest elsewhere in ugly ways often.
yes.
what's funny is like this makes I found makes both Christians mad, and it makes people on the left mad when I say that the victimhood culture and the like is inherently a Christian byproduct.
It'd be more accurate to call it a Christian heresy, but yeah, that's fairly accurate.
Then you get this Gnostic dualism with
Well,
this gender madness, like when the
well, the reason why I say that it is like that is because the strain of victimhood culture, you could find it going way back to people like Christopher Columbus, and even during the Middle Ages, where this was a sort of common thing that they would do, like where they believed sincerely that in order to be redeemed by Jesus, that they had to make themselves into victims.
Hmm. Yeah, it's the what I'm saying is a heresy is the taking of things to the point of the taking things to the point of the inversion, where where the victim becomes the hero, where the victim is not the object of pity, but rather where the victim is ipso facto the morally superior one, where the only way that you can actually be good is by being a victim, that sort of thing. Or alternatively, the other thing where all of life needs to be upended for the sake of the victim, so that the exception becomes the basis of the rule. That sort of stuff is what I'm saying is a Christian heresy. That it is, but the reason it's a Christian heresy is because you will find very much within Christianity that the stone which the builders have rejected has become the cornerstone. And so the very Christianity by its nature does upend the world. That the greatest shall be last, and he who wished to be first must be the servant of all. That Jesus goes and washes his disciples' feet. Says, if I, the master, have done this, how much more should you do? So within Christianity, you do very much see there is within Christianity an upending of the world. That the world, generally speaking, tends to be organized that the more powerful dominate the weaker. And Christianity points out that the fundamental organization of the world is actually that the greater something is, the more it serves the lesser. And so that my favorite metaphor for it is actually the pile of champagne glasses. You have the one at the top, and then 4, and then 16, and so on. Or forget if it has a strict progression like that.
uh,
And then you pour into the top, and then when it overflows, it pours into the next, and when they overflow, it pours into the next level.
yeah,
That's really the fundamental organization of how creation is structured. That God pours in superabundance into creation, and then the creature being filled, more than filled, being given more than its fill, then has an additional being to pass on. And it can't give it higher, it can only give it lower. And so, in turn, on and on, you get the multiple layers of where each is serving the lesser, because that's how creation works, where God brings the creature into the very act of creation. God, in time, as we're interacting with each other, gives it to us to be, some aspect of his act of creation. Parents are the really obvious one, where two people come together and then take part with God in the act of making a third person. But even teaching is like this. Like, if you teach something to somebody, you are part of God's act of creating this knowledge in them. And so this is the fundamental organization of reality: is that the greater the greater is to serve the lesser, and it is in serving the lesser that the greater takes part in the act of creation of the lesser. And so that really is the fundamental structure of reality. Um, it only works and only makes any sense given the superabundant gift of God to creation. That God gives us not only what we need, but more that we need, so that we can then, like God, be generous and give to others. But so you're quite right. Like, that is very much in Christianity, and so it is a natural thing to not fully. If one does not fully grasp that aspect of Christianity, it is really easy to take that sort of inversion of what the fallen world takes to be the natural order, in that, because the fallen world has inverted the natural order, to then essentially like seek out to to essentially, if you get it wrong, doing things like seeking out to be a victim is a kind of natural thing. So I mean, you're not wrong there.
I mean, well, I think the premises, like if I were to give an argument for what they believe, it would be essentially this. Premise one, Christians ought to be like Jesus. Premise two, Jesus was a social victim. Conclusion, Christians ought to be social victims.
Yeah, I mean, you can see that in people who sought out martyrdom, for example. People
Okay.
who specifically tried to be martyred.
Yeah, it was heavily exaggerated, the accounts of the martyrs during the first 3 centuries, even though, like, there were cases of that, like, few of them, like, that we know of, but the rest were exaggerated tales of this empire-wide persecution, even though the persecutions that actually did occur were more localized events.
Mm-hmm. But you can see, you can see. I mean, there are also recent times when people would seek out being martyrs. It happens on occasion that you'll find somebody who specifically will like go out of his way to try to find people who will probably kill him for proclaiming Christianity. It's a very rare thing, but it does happen. So you will see that. And I mean, the modern context where we are is a really complicated one, because part of it is just straight up power seeking. That, like, if you can represent yourself as defending somebody who's being victimized, that's a way of gaining power. So, like, part of it too is just that it's one of the dynamics that we see, is people simply seeking power in whatever way seems possible to them to get. So there's that. But just, if I could bring it back to the New Atheists for a moment, that the New Atheists were useful for a while, because finding people who are already doing what you want to do anyway is always sort of the best way to do that thing, because they're very sincere. They're not just doing it in the moment. They've always been doing it. It's just, why are they popular now? Why are people paying attention now, as opposed to before, when they were doing the same thing and no one was paying attention? And so that's what I would argue is why the New Atheist movement became popular. And then once Islamic terrorism recedes from popular consciousness, for whatever reasons that it does, that need no longer exists. And so I think that one of the factors, because I mean, there are always threads that make up the fabric, right? It's never just one thread that makes up an entire fabric of what's happening. But I would argue that one of the major threads of why the New Atheists are not very relevant now is that need that they were fulfilling has largely gone away. And even also, another one of them, the Christian fundamentalists who,
Yeah.
who are making a lot of noise about, like, teaching creationism in public schools,
Yeah.
for example. They're not really doing that anymore. So, so that's sort of another reason that, like, another thing that was generating something of a need to be able to reject it, and that need isn't really here anymore either. Did you by any chance see my video, or just see the video from Dawkins?
Yeah, that Dawkins about how it sounds like a cult.
Oh yeah. The recruitment video for the Richard Dawkins Society. I'm sorry, the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the recruitment, it's since been absorbed, actually. I looked this up a year ago, I think, into the James Randi Foundation, or whatever exactly James Randi's thing is called, I forget. So it's not an independent foundation anymore. But at the time, I think this is before then, and they made that recruitment video, if you are one of us, be one of us. Which was,
Yeah.
that video was so funny. I mean, it was just such a straight up cult recruitment video.
I mean, New Atheism was a cult. It kind of is, and it's. But Dawkins is kind of being thrown under the bus because like I said, many of the New Atheists have like switched to the woke cult. And now they're after him now, and after all dissonant voices that don't go in line with the new cult.
Yeah.
Well,
like religious tendencies don't really go away. Like even when you don't lose your faith, you just find something else to latch it onto. Because
to me, the
because
reason why atheists tend to be more on the left seems to me like this is maybe a generalization, but it's what I've observed. It's that usually atheists come from these very fundamentalist, hardcore, no, there is no black and white sort of thing, homes of Christian fundamentalism.
well, yeah, that's why they look at the Bible the same way.
What I generally find happening is that when they were Christians, they sort of seem like things that worked like this, where God was the ultimate high, and that, and the government was informed by God. But once they left God behind, the only thing that they had left was government. So they had to take all that dedication that they originally had to God and had to move it to a second higher power.
Well, the closest thing to high power they can find in science, because it's a human thing to worship. It's been part of the human condition for 70,000 years, and it's never going away. Like when you try to get rid of religion again, you'll just lash on to someone else. Like when the communists did that, they just found it in their dictators.
Yeah, well, actually, it's I think a point worth noticing that Marxism, as it is popularly understood, because I haven't read Marx yet. It's another one of those that I'm going to get to at some point.
Jordan Peterson read it, so you don't have to.
Yeah, I'll have to check out his summary of it. But at least popular Marxism it has. I mean, there are ways you can consider it a Christian heresy in that it has a soteriology, for example. The popular version of Marxism, has a struggle, but wherein people will then be saved by the communist revolution. And so it satisfies that religious need for a soteriology. I mean, it also, it has its own version of original sin to explain why there is suffering in the world.
And instead of all humans being sinful, it's a class problem, and with it's a race and stuff.
What's funny is that when I was actually going over a debate over was Hitler a Marxist, and I pointed out before that no, Hitler wasn't a Marxist, but not for the most intelligent reasons. The reason why he wasn't a Marxist was pretty simple. Marx was a Jew.
And that's
because Hitler's premises were like this. Premise 1, Jews are wrong about everything. Premise 2, Karl Marx is a Jew. Conclusion, therefore Marxism is by default wrong.
Yeah, well, to be fair, and this is the thing, Hitler was a national socialist, not an international socialist. And so, the Marxists generally are the international socialists. And so, I mean, there wasn't actually very much difference between them, which is why people constantly shifted around between the various socialist organizations, willy-nilly. I still love that thing. It was a term the Nazis had for somebody who was in the Nazi party but was really a communist at heart. That they were a beefsteak Nazi, brown on the outside but red on the inside.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah. So I mean, another one of his disagreements too was simply that he was a national socialist, not an international socialist. So they had that, but
That's
bringing
how.
it into. Go ahead.
Actually, I was gonna say that you can continue afterwards, but New Atheism we can see as a sect of Protestantism, while at the same time also a succession of Marxism, because a lot of Hitchens' propaganda was plagiarized from Soviet material, and he made it popular over here to people who didn't know any better.
Well, I mean, you have to remember that Christopher Hitchens was a literal communist.
Yeah, he's a Trotskyite, not a
life.
Leninist.
Yeah.
Yes, so right there ought to tell you that he doesn't have a good track record of being correct.
No, he sure
Well,
doesn't.
it's not even that, the track record being correct. I mean, it's just to show that, I mean, that is, well, what's funny is that they still get on him for his position because he actually supported the Iraq War.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that was
Yeah.
sort of like the one thing that they sort of got on him about. But yeah, people have to remember his entire view of why the Iraq War was justified was simply this premise that Muslims are evil and must be stopped.
Yeah, Hitchens was not. Hitchens had a beautiful voice, an absolutely beautiful voice, a wonderful sense of rhythm in his speaking. It was actually something I did. He wasn't much of a thinker, but Christopher Hitchens, that is.
Right.
But in actually in the video that I did, Christopher Hitchens isn't serious. There's one part where I actually paused him and explicitly said, like, I'm actually don't object to this thing. It's just completely unconnected to what comes next, and I just want to put some space between them because, like the melody of his voice makes it sound like these two thoughts are connected. But if you take a moment and then think about the two of them without the melody of his voice, the thing he said just now and the thing he said as if it's the natural conclusion of it literally have nothing whatever to do with each other.
Yeah, there's also
And so,
there's also this British twat that on YouTube that tries to be like him, like at Rationality Rules, he calls himself, quote unquote. Like he tries. He has this posh accent. It's really kind of forced British accent, but to fool his followers into thinking he's smart. But he's just a total dumbass.
Well, you have to remember this. What can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. You asserted that without evidence, so therefore I dismiss it without evidence.
yeah. I always love when Eve Kaninen applies the principle of retortion to that. Well, you asserted, or was that what you were doing, Mr. Brass, saying that like,
Yeah.
say, oh, okay, you were doing the retortion thing yourself?
Yeah.
Ah, sorry, gotcha. Yeah.
Frank Turek actually got me into the principle of retortion.
Yeah. For anyone listening who doesn't know, it's that if you apply a principle to itself and it fails, then it's clearly not a very good principle. That's to say, it's clearly not a universal principle, because any principle should survive itself.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's sort of like, we can't know anything, and I just simply ask, do you know that?
Yeah.
It's William Lane Craig is, and other apologists, is one of the most misrepresented. What do you make of him?
I actually, I know very little of William Lane Craig.
Compared to Ed Taser?
Yeah, I mean, I'm far more familiar with Phaser. The other thing, there are a few things about William Lane Craig, because if memory serves, William Lane Craig thinks that God is inside of time.
Yeah.
And so that in itself is just sort of a big problem for me, because
I never understood that. You can't create something and then be inside it. Unless
yeah.
Well, his argument,
unless you're manifest.
Before creation, God was outside of time, but once he created, he came into time.
See, I got the impression Craig almost thought there were like two parallel time continuums, that God's in one and then created time space, the creation which has its own timeline. line, but but he like Craig rejects divine simplicity, for example, and so if you, I mean, if you hold that God is composed of parts, that are capable of independent existence but are together, but not for any reason.
I mean,
like
parts. Like, what do you mean parts?
Well, so I mean,
A car.
well, if you hold, so I mean, he rejects divine simplicity. I've seen, I forget exactly what I saw, but he was very explicit that he rejects the concept of divine simplicity. So if you reject the concept of divine simplicity, if God is not simple, the only alternative is that God is composed of parts of some nature or other, but that God is composed of multiple things capable of independent existence. Because that's the only alternative to divine simplicity. And so, like he thinks. I'm pretty sure I saw this. I don't want to misrepresent him, so I don't want to state this with complete confidence. But like, I'm pretty sure, for example, like he thinks that God changes.
Changes form or nature.
Yeah, or like changes his mind, changes what he's thinking. That
I mean, literal, ultra literal readings of the Old Testament would say that.
Right, exactly. Like that God repenting of the evil that he intended to do for man.
Yeah, and talking in the dialogue with the argument with Moses and saying, "Oh, I hate these Israelites." Then a literal reading with that would indicate that God changed his mind on that when Moses was like, "No, let me talk to them. I'll reason with them."
Yeah, or again, Abraham with the with Sodom and Gomorrah.
Yeah.
If there are 50 just men, will you destroy it?
Yeah.
Etc. Yeah, so like taking that literally as opposed to taking this metaphorically. And because the problem, the problem I have with Craig, at least is that given the various philosophical concepts he rejects, that he seems to believe that like this sort of description of God changing is actually a description of God like literally changing. That the problem like that leads to some very bad places if you work that out. That and so like because the problem is like you can't change and be perfect because you can't lack nothing and also change. If part of you comes into being or part of you departs from being, which is what change means, then you've kind of got a problem with being that's not compatible with being perfect. um you run into problems with God being happy, because the divine simplicity, one of the things divine simplicity clearly shows is that God is happy since God doesn't lack anything. But like if God is changing, God lacks things. I mean, God clearly lacks whatever he isn't at present.
I mean, God clearly has a sense of humor. Just look at how Muhammad died. He got
Poison lamb.
He got poisoned by a Jewish woman and died the same way that he said that a false prophet would die. Like his aorta will be cut, and when he was poisoned by the Jewish girl, he said,
Right.
"I feel as if my aorta is being cut."
Yeah. Right. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that. I actually really like in I forget which gospel it is now, but the one when the people came up and said, "Does your master not pay the temple tax?" Peter said, "Of course he does." And then he went to Jesus before he had a chance to say anything, and Jesus said, "Peter, the kings of the earth collect taxes from their sons or from foreigners." And he said, "Well, from foreigners." He said, "Well, then sons are exempt. But so that we won't offend them, go and cast a hook into the water, take the first fish that bites, and in it you'll find a coin worth twice the temple tax." I forget the actual amounts. Give it to them for me and for you. There's just something so, to me, just this way of paying the temple tax is just, there's something so beautifully and unnecessarily complicated about it that I just love. Or again, the one about, is it legitimate to pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus said, "Show me the coin that you pay the taxes with." And then asked, "Whose face is this?"
Yep, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is. If
Right.
only right wing, if only right wing fundamentals would get that through their head.
That would be helpful, yes. It really would. But there's no way to hold up a coin and say, "Whose head is this?" in this context, and for this not to, I mean, Jesus couldn't possibly not know whose head it was. Everyone knew whose head was on the coin.
Yeah,
So
he was asking the people if they knew who it was so that he can illustrate the point.
So, I mean, like, there's no way I can see, how do you hold up, like, if I hold up a dollar bill to you, I don't have one on hand, and say, whose head is this?
Washington.
Like, there's something comedic about this because, like, obviously And so, like the fact, in context, like they're, sort of acting as if they don't know whose head is on this. And so he's pointing this out. It's intrinsically comedic. Um, And, when people read something in church, there's nothing that a lector can read that they can't make sound solemn, um, no matter what. But that said, it's clearly comedic. Anyway, I'm sorry, digression aside, yes, God has a sense of humor. Very, seems to be very true. Um, the,
Well,
but so this is sort of, I haven't looked into Craig well enough, but roughly speaking, just to sort of crystallize the point of my answer, his rejection of divine simplicity really makes me concerned because it tends to it would suggest to me that he either hasn't actually thought this through or that he has and has come to some bad places and just doesn't discuss it much. And I don't know which of these two it would be because like again, since he believes that everything is intrinsically in time in all cases, he runs up against the problem. I saw him talking about this in one clip of like, well, how do the people in heaven not sin? So like if you're entering into eternity and so you make an eternal choice to outside of time, like the angels, in the moment of their creation enter into eternity, created eternity, and so they eternally make their choices, and that's why they're in some sense fixed in their choice because they never stopped making the choice. The fallen angels have not stopped choosing to turn away from God, and the unfallen angels have not stopped choosing to do God's will. So like they haven't stopped doing these things such that they could make a new choice because they are eternal creatures, if in a created eternity rather than temporal creatures that are constantly changing. And so if you have a temporal version of heaven where heaven is just like unending change, it makes no sense why people in heaven would never sin. However, if you allow for eternity, that that as Jesus said, that in heaven men and women no longer marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels. That if in salvation we then enter into a created eternity where we cease to be changing, but so the choice is an eternal choice, that one is is in that eternity making one unified choice that is a choice in the truly full sense of choice rather than the sort of partial choices we make unfurled over time where we don't actually see the choices that we're making. We're sort of guessing at what we're actually doing, but in entering into eternity, thus heaven or hell, that we are thus eternally choosing in a full sense. It makes perfect sense why those in heaven don't sin anymore. And so what Craig had to speculate about was that, well, maybe people in heaven don't have free will anymore, which
No,
is
it's like like when you're like for instance that that certain things are unhealthy that you eat now, but when you get older you have the wisdom and then gee, that stuff I ate when I was a kid was really unhealthy, so you no longer have the desire to do that. Like it's not that you don't have free will, you just the desire's not in you, you're not tempted by it.
the problem with that is that it's not like the fallen angels didn't know what they were doing.
Right.
So like the idea that they're, I mean, because to exist to exist and not be God is to be tempted with pride. Like you can't exist and not be God. I mean, God can't be proud because God's God. So God is the fullness of being. God is the St. Thomas put it, the subsistent act of to be. God is God. So God can't aspire any higher. So God can't be tempted to pride because God is God. But the rest of us can be tempted to pride simply by virtue of existing. And so if people were always changing, there would always be the potential to choose the worse over the good because you can never fully escape temptation. The mere act of existing makes it possible for you to be tempted. It gives the possibility of the temptation to think, to want to replace God with yourself. And so if you're always making fresh choices, then you can't be free of all temptation intrinsically. So yeah, so like you could imagine a world in which nobody's tempted to eat too much candy. So that's very imaginable to be sure. You could
There's
imagine a world in which nobody's.
in my head.
Well, I mean,
I'm saying,
the thing that always gets me is about the thing with divine command theory is that it does seem a bit unbiblical in some way because
remind
the
me what the
idea
term divine
behind,
command theory refers to.
I mean, divine command theory is this idea that in order for something to be immoral, it has to be commanded by God to say it is.
Ah, yes, thank you.
But to me, this seems patently unbiblical because if you look at the story of Cain and Abel, right?
Mm-hmm.
God tells Cain that what he did was bad, that he killed Abel, and Cain was like, "You didn't tell me not to kill," and so under divine command theory, that would seem to say, well, Cain was right.
Yeah, well, they always have it out because they can just say that God can retroactively command things.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah,
Yeah, but
but you're right. I mean, you're entirely correct. So let me be clear there. You were correct. Like it is very true that it's also very obvious that the nature of morality flows out of the nature of creation. That you're given speech in order to communicate truth, and therefore lying is wrong because it is violating your nature. You are given a nature to take part. A man and woman are given a nature to take part in joining together to make a child, and so to fornicate, where they're not joining to, where they're not using this, where they're essentially just doing drug-seeking behavior, and they are not taking on the responsibility of actually sticking together for the raising of the child that they were given to make. That it naturally flows out of what the thing is, what is moral and immoral about it. And so, you're very right. The divine command theory is both unbiblical, to be sure, and it's also just wildly irrational. As if lying could somehow possibly actually be good.
Well, people would generally give the argument that, well, if you have Jews in your basement and the Nazis come knocking and they say, "Do you have Jews in your basement?" Well, the moral thing we would typically think is to lie to the Nazis and say, "No, I don't have any Jews in my basement."
Yeah, the
But but under like a sort of natural law ethics, the moral thing to do would be to just say, "Yeah, I have Jews in my basement. Come get them."
well, actually, it doesn't follow, because the that's not the natural law theory. Does not actually do that. I was speaking a little bit fast and loose when I just said that lying could be good. The because here's the thing. Remember, the purpose of communicating is to communicate truth, but because all communication is contextual, um, so if you really expand out when they say, "Are there Jews in your basement?" What are they actually asking? Because this is not a free-floating question that has no context, and no intentionality surrounding
Are
it.
you with us or are you against us?
Well, it's not just that. They're also asking, do you have anyone here that we should kill? That's
Yeah,
really what they're asking. I mean, they're asking here, is there anyone here we should take away to the death camps?
obviously.
Now, if you expand out what the question really is asking, not just what are the words being used, but what is the actual truth value that they are attempting to discern, The correct answer to, is there anyone in your, in this house that we should take off to the death camps, is no, there is not. There's nobody in this house you should drag off to the death camps. Now, they are saying Jews as opposed to people we should drag off to the death camps is immaterial to the fundamentals of what is being communicated. So on a natural law reading of the situation, it is appropriate to tell them no, because the thing that they're asking you is, do you have anyone here we should drag off to the death camps? They're not, the fact that they are identifying them as Jews is only one part of their question. But there is the entire intentionality surrounding the thing, which is also very much a full part of the question. So the natural law reading is not in that circumstance that you should tell them, yep, they're Jews in the basement, go ahead and take them. It's that you should communicate to them truth. And what is true? What is the truth? The truth is there is nobody here they should be taking off to the death camps. Mm-hmm. And so when you tell them no, you are using your speech to communicate truth. It's only on a naive reading as if as if this were like a free-floating question that didn't actually mean anything, that you would come up with the answer of you have to say yes. So natural law theory does not mean that's an interesting analogy that may help in understanding that is glasses. So if somebody has a defect in the lens in their eye, what's happening is the lens in their eye is lying to the retina. That's to say the light comes in, the lens misfocuses it, hits the retina, and produces an incorrect image. What do the glasses they do in front do? The glasses take the light that's coming in and distort it. But they are distorting it in exactly the counter way, such that when it gets distorted by the lens of the eye, it comes out accurately on the retina. And so this sort of thing, like the telling the Nazis that there aren't Jews in the basement, is very analogous to what the lens is doing. In a strict sense, the lens of the glasses is lying to the lens of your eye, but it's doing it in precisely such a way that when the whole thing goes through, your eye actually perceives the truth.
Well, so yeah, a lot of people that generally a deontologist that I know, like a Kantian or something like that, would say, they would make a distinction between the moral and immoral and the legality. So they would say, well, it would be immoral to lie under those circumstances. If you did lie, you shouldn't be legally held accountable for it.
Yeah, I mean, what I certainly stand by in this circumstance is that the thing is not properly understood a law. You are not, in a full sense, that is to say, when you consider like what is the actual thing that you are trying to do here, you are not trying to, in a proper sense, you are not trying to communicate a false state of affairs to the Nazi. Mm-hmm. It's that there's some particular details that the Nazi is getting wrong that you are matching to how the Nazi gets wrong, such that when the Nazi screws them up, you are presenting to him something such that when the Nazi screws these things up, what he ends up with is the truth. Mm-hmm. So your goal when you're saying, no, there are no Jews in my basement, is to communicate the truth to the Nazi. It's just that the truth to the Nazi is that he should not come in and take anybody in the house away to the death camps. Mm-hmm. So the problem with the deontological sort of analysis is it is asking about truth and lying as if you were looking at like inputs to a computer program, because a computer doesn't do anything. And so, but I mean, like, you can even actually extend the analogy to a computer program. So suppose you have a computer program, right, that's like set up to, if you press the kill button, will kill a person. If you press the don't kill button, won't kill them. And you know that this computer's been screwed up such the wires are cross-wired. Do you have a moral imperative to press the don't kill button, even though that's wired into the kill switch and will kill the person? Just because the thing happens to have a label on it that says don't kill, even though you know that this is actually hooked up the computer is incorrectly wired inside.
Kind of like the meme with the guy sweating doesn't know which button to push.
Yeah, like you've got one of those things, and like the guy sweating knows that the computer is miswired, such that these buttons are essentially mislabeled. Just because the buttons are mislabeled, does the guy have a moral obligation to press the button that is mislabeled because it is mislabeled? And that's
What would he be if he doesn't press it? Press anything.
let's assume there's a timer that every like assume there's a timer that will choose the internal timer that will kill it, because I mean, obviously every time you get to a thought experiment like this, like they're underdefined, they're intrinsically unrealistic. So I guess the computer, if you don't press a button in 10 seconds, will default to killing the person, but that's past the miswiring.
A common the utilitarian sort of approach that I noticed to those situations is like they sort of typically give like the 9/11 scenario where they say, imagine you have a plane and it's been hijacked by Muslims and they're heading to a building.
Mm-hmm.
Now you have a choice. You can shoot the plane down and kill all the passengers inside. Or two, you can refrain from doing so and just let the plane crash into the building, which,
Mm-hmm.
of course, will kill both the people inside along with the people in the building.
Yeah.
The utilitarian would say, well, it would maximize utility in that sense to just strike the plane down, because it would be better like say 100 people on the plane die than
Mm-hmm.
thousands of people in the buildings and in the plane die.
Yeah. Well, there's a massive problem with utilitarianism, which is it's not actually possible to evaluate, because you never actually know what the consequences are. Like, the utilitarians always just chop it off after some amount of time. But let's say you knew that everybody on the plane were all Nazis, and the plane was originally on its way to uh, uh, I'm sorry. Let's say you knew everybody in the building. I'm sorry, I got that wrong. Were all Nazis, and that they were, intending shortly after their conference on the best way to capture and torture Jews to go out and capture and torture as many Jews as possible.
Mm-hmm.
At which point, you'd be better off letting the plane hit the building in that thing. But then again, but you don't know. You don't know who's in the building, so it's not like the utilitarian can actually evaluate the utility of allowing the plane to hit the building or stopping the plane from hitting the building. And then you can carry this on further, because of course, whether they die or live will have other consequences and so on, absolutely none of which the utilitarian knows. And given their multiplication through time, will very obviously, if known, outweigh any short-term considerations. And so the fundamental problem with utilitarianism is that it's literally impossible to evaluate it on utilitarian criteria. The utilitarian is always in the position of saying, well, I don't actually know what's going to happen. I have some inkling of some of the things that will happen, and I'm just going to say that's good enough. And so it's a really weird philosophy when your criteria for evaluating it contains an arbitrary cutoff on knowledge, when you clearly, obviously, don't have the overwhelming majority of knowledge relevant to making the decision. Anyway, in general, the plenty of Catholic thought gives a natural morality framework for answering that question, which is the principle of double effect, which is that if you shoot down the plane, the thing you're trying to achieve is the stopping of the plane from murdering thousands of people. So this is the primary effect that you're going to achieve. The secondary effect you're going to achieve is killing all of the people on the airplane. Your goal is to simply disable the thing from flying. And if you could do that in some way such that the plane might crash land and people survive, that would obviously be better. So if you have some way of doing something like just an EMP pulse that will knock out the guidance computer, but that'll knock out the engines, but you still have wire-based aileron command because it's an old enough airplane, that like you at least have a hope of landing the thing. With people surviving, that would obviously be preferable. So like those sorts of things go into the calculation of the principle of double effect. But essentially, if there is no way to achieve the primary effect that you intend, which is the disabling of the aircraft to save the people in the building, without killing the innocent people on the airplane, that the and that the good of disabling the airplane from killing these thousands of people is in fact a legitimate good that is worth it. That if you have any way of doing this such that you can not kill the innocent people, then you need to take it. But if it is not open to you, if it is simply physically impossible to disable the airplane from killing thousands of people, while saving the lives of the people on the airplane, then it is permissible in order to do this action because the circumstances available to you don't enable you to, and the moral culpability for the deaths of the people is on the person who intentionally created the circumstance whereby these people could not be saved. It's even, the analysis there under double effect is even easier since the people on the airplane will die one way or another anyway. So, your only hope would be some sort of like Mission Impossible style, airplane comes up and, with lots of parachutes and you cut your way in without making the plane disintegrate, which would be impressive in its own right, and, save them all. But, short of things that only work in movies, the analysis under the principle of double effect, which is a natural morality principle, makes that situation very intelligible, such that the thing, roughly speaking, the utilitarian is looking for, but can't actually arrive under his own philosophy at, you can arrive to with the principle of double effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like to look at it sort of like a side effect, sort of. Like you said, the purpose of shooting the plane down is not to kill the people in there. It's to stop it from hitting the building. The side effect of that is that it kills the people, but that's not the primary purpose of why you're doing it.
Yeah, and then there's the question: is there any way we can achieve the effect without the side effect?
Mm-hmm.
And if there is, then obviously that's the one to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's only if it's
sort of like this. The point of eating chocolate is to get nutrition,
mm-hmm.
or to get some sense of pleasure out of the way it tastes.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the point of now. The side effect is if you do it too much, you're going to gain weight.
Mm-hmm.
So
also make yourself sick.
So I like to sort of look at it like that, where it's a case of what's your intention and what's the side effects of your intention.
Especially those white chocolate Hershey cookies and cream bars. That's like heroin to me.
Yeah.
Well, we have actually come up way past the hour mark. We got into an hour and 38 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, it's practically tomorrow, so.
Yeah, so we should be wrapping up a little bit.
Right. Tell the dear audience where to find you.
Yeah.
Oh, Missing the Mark on YouTube. Probably the easiest and most relevant place here, especially after all the discussion of it. The channel name is Missing the Mark. I also have a video explaining why.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I believe you have a Twitter as well.
Yeah, but essentially, I only post blog. I sort of on my blog, it just automatically posts blog posts. So the Twitter, I mean, it suffices as an RSS feed at this point, essentially. But occasionally, I will go and check mentions in it every few days at this point. But I found Twitter an environment insufficiently conducive to the sort of peaceful life necessary to be productive. Whether to be a good father to my children or to work on novels and blog posts and videos and whatnot. So I'm not very active on Twitter anymore.
Oh, you work on novels?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've got uh, one science fiction, one superhero novel, and 2 murder mysteries.
That's lovely.
You gotta promote that shit so people will hear of it.
Yeah.
You should make where you sort of combine all those elements into one thing.
Superhero science fiction murder mystery.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting. Superheroes on a spaceship in the future,
Yeah.
solving
Or
a murder.
like a western, a cowboy, or a spaceman, or a what was that?
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
could be yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Damn, what was
it's
that?
nice talking to you, Chris.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much for
It
having
could
me.
be a football player, or a king, or a spaceman, or a football playing king in space.
I'm not quite remember. I don't quite get the reference.
SpongeBob.
Ah,
Yeah.
yeah, I felt
All
like
right.
it.
Well, yeah, like I said, it was nice talking to you. We should figure out a way to do this again sometime in the future.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And thank you again for your patience and my difficulty with timing. Um,
Yeah.
but
Habitable.
yeah, I really enjoyed the conversation. We hit on a lot of interesting subjects.
All right.
All right. All right, go follow Missing the Mark on what site was it?
YouTube.
Your blog.
Oh, that's blog.chrislansdown.com.
All right, go find them there, and see you next time. Peace out.